All right, welcome everyone. My name is Tongmin Lee. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. I'm going to chair the session for Nicole today. Firstly, a few things for housekeeping. The seminar is recorded and then live streamed for our off-campus postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who are going to join remotely today. And afterward. If you're interested in asking question or participating in the discussion, it looks like we're going to have fairly small group. So feel free to ask question using chat or raise your hand directly and asking question to Nicole as you wish. The session will be also recorded, and recording will be available on our department website and the YouTube channel. So if you feel uncomfortable to show your face, you can stay mute and also stay mute and also turn off your camera, please. I will introduce Nicole for the audience today. So Nicole Pitterson is assistant professor in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech University in the USA. And her research interests include increasing students' conceptual understanding of complex concepts of curriculum design and promoting collaboration using different types of active learning strategies, and also explore student disciplinary identity through engagement with the knowledge in the field of engineering education. So she's been working with some of our department colleagues, including John McAfee and Paul Ashwin on the project. So she's particularly want to welcome her to join us and share her work today with us. So her presentation title will be How Are Engineering Students Navigating Curriculum Demands, Time Constraint, and Heavy Workloads? So Nicole, if you're ready, could you please join in?
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Let me start my presentation here. I'll share my screen. Okay, perfect. I think you can see my slides. So thank you and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to talk to you a little bit about this project I've been fortunate to be a part of for the last 4 years. As was mentioned, I do work with Jan MacArthur, Paul Ashwin, and I see some of my other co-hosts, Jenny Case, co-collaborators in the audience. I'm sorry if I missed anyone. But before we begin, I do want to tell you a little bit about my background. So I completed a bachelor's in electrical and electronic engineering at the university in my home country, the University of Technology, Jamaica, where I specialized in power systems. After my undergrad, I went to Western Illinois, where I completed a master's in manufacturing engineering. And immediately following achieving my master's degree, I worked with a company called Methode. They are a fairly large manufacturing company in the Midwestern parts of the US. And I worked there as a power systems engineer for a little under a year. I personally felt challenged by what I thought engineering was and what I was actually doing. And so I felt for the most part, I was babysitting machines. I did some programming, but this glamorized idea that was in my head of what I was going to do as an engineer did not come to fruition. And so I moved back home to Jamaica, and I was there for a bit trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And during the time I was trying to figure out my next steps, I went to teach high school. I thought, how hard can it possibly be? It is introductory engineering concepts. So I ran an introduction to electrical engineering program at this high school for grades 10 and 11 students. And that was when I felt the most challenged, not because the content I knew, teaching I knew nothing about. And you get to a point where you start to wonder, what am I doing wrong? They're just not getting it. So after a bunch of failures, I would call it, trying to figure out how to teach them. I'm teaching them as how I learned it, and they were just not getting it. I started doing some research as to what may cause some concepts to be difficult for students to understand, but not only the concepts, but what am I doing as an instructor that's not helping my students to understand. And that's how I found that there was a program, a group of people studying this thing called engineering education. So I went to Purdue University to do my PhD in engineering ed. It's the first program of such in the US. So there was a whole lot of hype around what they did. I was just curious about why are some concepts difficult for some students and not for others. So my research work, my dissertation work at Purdue was focused around these difficult concepts, foundational concepts in electrical engineering, and what can instructors do in their course design and content delivery to mitigate these difficulties. From there, I went to Oregon State, where I did a postdoc, and really still around this idea of increasing cognitive engagement in large engineering classes for conceptual understanding. So there was a definite line between my PhD and what I did for my postdoc. And halfway through my postdoc, I took this job at Virginia Tech as an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering Education. So my research areas, as I discussed, I advise 5 PhD students, and all their work is within this space. This, you could say, capture really my research. So looking at difficult concepts in formal and informal learning environments, specifically engineering environments. How do we foster and assess conceptual understanding of fundamental engineering concepts? So while most of my dissertation work was focused on electrical engineering, I've now broadened to look across all engineering, primarily because all engineering disciplines have these foundational concepts that are difficult for students to understand. I still work in the space of increasing cognitive engagement in large engineering courses. And most recently with this project, thanks to Jenny Case for inviting me to be a part of this initiative. Now I also work in the space of understanding the transformative power of disciplinary knowledge. So let me talk a little bit about the broad project. I know some of you have heard of this project multiple times, but just to contextualize what I'll be talking about today, I just want to give a really quick snapshot about this project. So there are 2 problems or 2 issues that we seek to address with the Understanding Knowledge and Student Agency project. And the first one is that there really is a lack of understanding about how students develop as professionals as they engage with discipline-specific knowledge. And the approach we have used, or the approach we designed to study that, is a longitudinal research study. So we follow students from their first year of enrollment into their degree programs through to a year of work. That's the original study. And the intended or anticipated outcome is that this would improve our theoretical and analytical understanding of how students develop as professionals as they engage with this disciplinary knowledge. And then the other issue is that, multiple universities, especially the countries we study, belong to this coalition called the Washington Accord. And in there is an understanding that a student who has a particular degree from a particular country, the degrees, the outcomes are the same. However, there is not a whole lot of work done about looking comparatively at the influence of the discipline, the institutions the students attend, as well as the national context in which the institution is based. And so for that, we used a comparative approach with the intent of seeing, uncovering, investigating, insert whatever word here, insights into the distinctive features of engineering or scientific ways of thinking, and how these insights are influenced by the discipline, the institution, and the country in which it exists. So here are the 3 questions I think we are seeking, the 3 questions we seek to answer with this larger study. What forms of knowledge do students have access to through their curricular program in their particular degrees? How are their individual identities transformed by engaging with this knowledge? And then what are how the different contexts influences these outcomes, processes and outcomes. You could say this graphic captures the motivation of the project. So we contend that students enter their degree programs, as you'll see towards the end of the arrow. And every year they are influenced by the discipline-specific knowledge. However, this discipline-specific knowledge is encompassed by the influence of the institution they are enrolled in. And then the institution also exists within a national context. And so what you have is the student going from year one through to work, each year being influenced by several contexts or several layers. And at the end, what we are assuming is that their agency is developing as they're progressing through their programs, through the specific engagement with knowledge. So a little bit more about the context. So the project is really large. It's a large collaborative effort among 3 countries, as you'll see, England, USA, and South Africa. And in each country, we identified 2 universities which are similar yet different. So we may have 2 research-intensive institutions or a research-intensive and a teaching-focused institution, but they all have different student demographics, or they're located in different geographical areas, such as one's a rurally located institution, whereas one is more urban, or one may have all the students living there, so it's a residential campus, whereas the other, more than 50% of the students commute. We also selected 2 programs per institution, specifically chemical engineering and chemistry. In the US, we had to recruit biochemistry students because of its close nature to chemistry, and so that we would have enough students for when we built our case studies. So the first year, we actually recruited broadly, and we went to find as much students as we possibly can. And then in the second year, we started to tailor that so we would have 10 students per program. And we tried to make the sample as diverse as possible. And by diverse, I mean characteristics such as race and ethnicity, reported gender, and even cultural background. So there's a question towards the end of this interview where we would ask the students, how do you identify? And using that information, we would try to ensure that we had a really broad range of participants. We also interviewed 1 instructor per program. So we identified a core course for the different disciplines. So a core chemical engineering course or a core chemistry course for that year. And we would interview the instructors, and I'll talk a little bit more about data generation in the next slides. And then this particular leg of the project was run over 5 years. So 4 years in school and then 1 year on the job. So we generated a whole lot of data for this project. So we have the student interviews. We also asked the students to provide a course assessment. By course assessment, I mean some type of graded work, whether a homework assignment or a quiz or a test, something that they submitted, received feedback on, and we use that as part of the interview. For the instructors, we would record a class, and then the research team would watch the recording and use what we saw in the recording to finalize the interview protocol, after which the instructors were interviewed. And then towards the end, we interviewed department contacts and collected curriculum documents. I should point out that in the US, and I think across all the sites, the students were interviewed in the second half of that year. So in the first year for us, they were interviewed in the spring, and we kept that constant. So because we have so much data, really where we focus most of our energy so far is looking at the student interviews, because there's just so many of them. So the data was the interviews transcribed and then chunked into broad codes that I'm showing here. These are the broad areas in which we had chunked the data. So the path to degree and university chunk is where students discuss why they are going to university in the first place. So this is where they talk about their career aspirations or other social factors for choosing their particular university and degree type. The me now code captures their understanding of themselves, who they are in that time. So who they are at first year, second year, third year, and so on, and how they're adjusting to university, or how their sense of self has changed since they started coming to university. The future me code is their own perception of who they are becoming as disciplinary figures. So how do they see themselves situated in chemistry, in their particular discipline, chemistry, chemical engineering, or biochemistry, and who they will become in terms of employment or just their personal life. The course experience chunk, this is where we really tried to capture the time students are putting in outside of class, how they describe the time they put into studying in and out of class, strategies they use for studying, personal views of teaching methods or course content. And then the assessment experience one is the student's description of their understanding of the purpose of a particular assignment or the entire assessment process in general. Under the relation to discipline would be where students are describing their own understanding of what the discipline is in terms of both content and disciplinary knowledge. The wider university code then captured how students view their responsibility towards their own studies and their overall student experience while at university, as well as the university's responsibility towards them. The finance code obviously is where they talk about their experiences or reasons for attending university due to the mode of how they are paying for school or who's paying for school. And then finally, the diversity and difference code is where students were asked specifically about how diversity is represented in their discipline in terms of demographics or other minority student experiences. So because we have so much data, we created working groups. So in these working groups, there are specific focus. So the knowledge group, for example, looks at how students' experiences with disciplinary knowledge and how they describe what someone in their field does, or what someone having that kind of disciplinary knowledge would be able to do or be. The study practices group focuses on the course experience, specifically how students are developing as they move through their degree programs, as it relates to their learning, what kind of study strategies they use, their overall approaches to studying. And then the curriculum comparison group, because we have so many institutions and countries, looks across all the curricula in all contexts to see how the knowledge itself is organized and what counts as mandatory for students to know and do. The society group explores students' understanding of their role in society, both the personal and public value of their degrees, how they're contributing to society as a whole. And then the personal project group, the one I'm least familiar with, as I'm not involved with that group, I'd say explores how students develop professional and personal identities from one year to the next. So back to the topic at hand. So today I'm going to talk a bit about one particular study that came out of the study practices group. So let's just jump right in. So in this particular study, we were grounding it around 3, maybe 4 key aspects from the literature. So the literature talks about the complex and dynamic relationship between teaching and learning. And several people have done work around what the types of interactions that universities strive to foster. I know Paul Ashwin talks about the synergistic interactions between teaching and learning. John Biggs, he talks about the constructive alignment within the curriculum. So not just curriculum design, but content delivery. And then there are several studies that talk about how the role of pedagogy in actively engaging students. But what we see is that the engineering curriculum is tightly packed. It governs the body of knowledge. So basically what is taught, when it's taught, and the foundational concepts that students need to move from one level to the next. But it is very much restrictive in terms of students have very little wiggle room, and there's just a whole lot of content packed in the curriculum. When compared to students in the arts or social sciences, we find that engineering students have less choice of subjects and even less unstructured study time. So then this means that students are often faced with the challenge of acquiring significant bodies of knowledge that are delivered in multiple formats. And by that, I mean, they have face-to-face time during lecture classes, they have practicals, they have structured tutorials, they have all these other things that fall on their schedule from day to day, and they still have to be doing homeworks and lab projects outside of class. There are some studies in engineering ed specifically that looks at the benefits that are achieved when students are actively engaged and how they're motivated to learn. So we have several researchers who have looked at how students' levels of motivation and interest in the study makes their learning more meaningful. However, very few have looked at the impact of time demand that students experience as a result of a fairly rigid and tightly packed curriculum and the overall impact of demanding course workload. So we created this visual, I think after looking at the first year data. So this is based on the first year of chemical engineering, first year of all the chemical engineering programs at all the universities. The two universities that starts with letter S were the South African universities. The two with A are the American universities, and the two with E are the English institutions. And you'll see how we broke down across academic year. So that first year, as we looked at the different requirements for students, you'll see that there are so many lecture hours per week. All the students had practical hours or lab hours per week, the amount of time they spent in tutorials, and then we totaled up the total hours per week, found out how many teaching weeks were in each academic year, so fall and spring semester, if you will. And then the very end of the table, the last column shows how many hours per academic year the students were in a very structured learning environment. And you can look at the numbers and be alarmed at just how much time they have to spend. And this does not take into consideration working on homeworks or projects. And some students may at any given time be taking 5 or 6 courses a semester. So with that in mind, we designed a study looking specifically at the second year chemical engineering students across all contexts. And we performed a thematic analysis of the students using the course experience chunk that I explained earlier. So we performed a thematic analysis of the data involved in that chunk, and 3 main codes immediately popped up. So the not coping, coping, and agency. We also found some sub-themes, which is a transition to coping and transition to agency. So not coping captures students' discussion of their inability to achieve the intended results. So that would mean not meeting course demands or keeping up on top of their studies outside of class time. While the coping code captured their ability to achieve the intended results while not expressing their own personal choices or strategies in doing so. So they met the requirements for their course, but they didn't, it was just like going along, just keeping on top of everything else that was going on. And then the agency code highlighted the clear individual strategy for using their time outside of class, coupled with their own direction towards making meaning of course material. So this was more than just task completion. And then the transition codes, so transition to coping would capture where students were at once not coping, but now we're seeing evidence of them being on top of their studies. While the transition to agency is where we would see evidence where they were just coping, but now they're actually starting to exhibit some amount of control over their studies. So when we performed this thematic analysis, you will see here we had 51 students. And this table shows how the numbers came out as across universities, but also across our different codes. You'll see that coping is the most common one we found. 47 of the students reported having some instance of coping, but we also found evidence of all the other 4, except for at Samarium, we had no evidence of transition to agency. So the not coping code encompasses students' reports of struggling and or failing to complete tasks associated with their day-to-day course expectations in a timely manner. This goes beyond being simply stressful to cope. For example, the students would talk about their experiencing stress so much that they cannot meet course demands. So the 4 areas that really came up under this not coping code was not having enough time, where several students attributed their inability to effectively manage their studies and lives more broadly to just not having enough time to practice and revise the material, or just time in general to fully grasp what was being taught. Under the difficulties coping of a personal nature, we saw students describing how they're struggling to keep up due to personality issues or just their perceived lack of ability to juggle multiple things at any given time. Students across all contexts talked about heavy course loads. So this theme came up across every institution in every program, where they would discuss the difficulties they have navigating the demands of multiple courses, and how by trying to meet the demands of one course, they would fall behind or had to drop the ball on meeting demands or deadlines for other courses. And then the final one, which was common again across all contexts, but we saw it mostly with the UK students, were the students expressing some degree of frustration with feeling like they were not provided enough direction or assistance from their instructors, which then further fueled their inability to cope. So what does not coping look like? So I'll give you a second just to read this quote here on the slide. So here, the student from Samarium University in South Africa, they have what they call project weeks. And the student was reflecting on a particular project week. That's when the chemical engineering, I guess, courses or course instructor tends to forget that they have other courses going on or that they have work going on. So they have fairly heavy workloads, and they have practical hand-ins for chemical engineering, and it takes a lot of time for them to get it done. And then they're using every free minute working on these projects, and therefore not meeting the demands for other projects. Here's another quote that just talks about how they could have understood the material better, but they didn't have time, so they just kind of rushed over things. So not a whole lot of time to spend really reflecting on the material by virtue of everything else that was going on. And then coping. So this was the most prevalent description, as you saw from the table earlier, of student study experiences, where we had 47 out of 51 students describing being able to meet the requirements for their course and expressing the view that they are managing to deliver course deliverables on a tight schedule. Students often refer to assess work at the point of the interview, where we ask them, how are things going academically? So we never ask the students, are you coping, or how are you coping? There's a question in the protocol where we would ask them, how are things going for you academically? And this is where we would get the response. I mean, both for all of this paper, it was where we really asked them about a week, what a typical week looks like, and then how are they doing. So what does coping look like? So here are 2 quotes, one from the US and one from England, where students are saying the pace has picked up in terms of their course load and complexity, but they've been able to keep up with it. Or one student was talking about how their timetable was full, having 16 hours a week, but that they have more time this year, this being their second year, to organize their time better and to keep on top of the course demands. The transition to coping, Claude, like I said, would be instances where we saw students reflecting on their first year experience of not coping and how they contrast these experiences with the present where they are coping. So here is an illustrative quote from a student from Sumerium. So they are indicating that they still have difficulty, as they termed it, there are loads of troubles and trials, but they still feel secure in continuing, enough to be continuing and stuff. So there's a whole lot going on, but now they're actually getting a grasp of meeting deadlines and being able to manage the course load. So what we learned from the coping and transition to coping codes is that there are some things that make coping hard to achieve and things that help. So being able to balance the demands from different courses and recognizing that each year the demands increase were things that made coping hard to achieve. But the students who were coping talked a lot about being able to manage their time using the structure of assessment demands, so how they use previous assessments to help them to prepare for the next thing. And quite frankly, some students just talked about dropping courses to get a lighter course load. So they would say, I dropped this course and now I have more time. So those were some of the strategies that the students were employing. And then looking beyond coping, in this work, we also looked for instances of agency, and we found evidence of transition to agency. So we have agency, which really is defined as approaches that reflected an explicit sense of the students having some control over their study approaches in the form of decision-making action. So how they chose to engage not only in class, but how they chose to use their time outside of class to meet their course demands. And then the transition to agency would be where students referred to how they were just coping, and now we are seeing where they're experiencing or having some sense of control. We found that the factors that enable agency were similar to those that enabled coping. And generally, those rested on the ways in which students responded to curriculum design, the workload design, including time pressures, the types of relationships they were building with their instructors and peers, as well as just what kinds of personal attributes they have that kind of help them to navigate this space and exhibit agency. Now, we do realize that student personality and characteristics is very individualistic, and we didn't study that. But we recognize that how a student is even socialized will influence how they demonstrate agency, but that was outside of the scope of our work. So agency, what does it look like? So here we see a quote where the student this English student is saying that they don't take notes when they go to a lecture. They wait until they go home and then make notes about it, because to them, they can't really listen and take notes in the lecture at the same time. So focusing all their attention in the lecture classes and then making the intentional effort of making notes when they get home. And that's one example. Here's another from an American student. So they're talking about how they spend the time during the week. So they can study during the weekdays, but then they use the weekends for finding that balance, for trying to catch up, for trying to get ahead. And then this example from a student at the other South African institution, Sodium, and they're talking about how they approach problem solving. So this strategy that they have for solving a problem, how they think critically, and how they go about analyzing the problem. So we found that for agency and transition to agency, there are certain enablers. So the student's personal disposition shapes whether they take a more agentic approach or not. Time comes up everywhere. So time is one of those constant factors across coping, not coping, and agency. So as the as the curriculum progressed, the students become less busy in terms of they have more free time. Some talk about dropping classes, some talk about assessment pieces being smaller, requiring less time, and so they can devote more time somewhere else. And then just the overall design of the instruction or the curriculum, how that is also creating a space for them to develop or exhibit signs of agency, and broadly the relationships they build with their peers, the relationship they build with their instructors, how by having that kind of relationship, they can have a sense of control and developing agency. Whoops, I went too far. So what are some key takeaways? So what we found was that the most common experience of coping appears strongly shaped by the curriculum and the amount of contact time that are required of the students. So for many students, while this provided a positive structure that keeps them on track, it also restricts their ability to make many independent decisions. So they keep up with the demands of the curriculum, as we see most of the students are coping, in that they are studying successfully. However, we do see instances where students were unable to navigate multiple courses and their related classes, and this leads to them feeling overwhelmed, and thus they are not coping. But then we saw where some students, most, exhibiting this idea of time management skills. The students who are able to manage their time well, they demonstrate having a sense of how much time they can devote to their studies, how they get their homeworks done, how they meet deadlines, and they're keeping that under control. But for the students who do not have these time management skills, that's where we see more evidence of them not coping. And then the last key takeaway that we have here is that we found across all the contexts, institutions, and programs that students are transitioning, as they transition from their first year to their second year, that they are taking on, a more ordered way, if you will, of managing the workload. We see where they're faced with the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, this challenge of acquiring significant bodies of knowledge delivered in multiple formats. But the students, they're learning how to cope, they're readjusting themselves. The consequences can be severe for those who do not manage this transformation, but we are encouraged that we did see majority of our students coping and developing these strategies. So what are some future steps? Well, currently as a group, we are looking at the second year chemistry students across all sites to see if our codes are there new things there because it's a different discipline, or will we find the same evidence of our codes, not coping and transition agency? We plan to look at the development of agency among the students across all contexts, all years. So this is just the second year chemistry students. We did some work earlier this year on students' perception of lectures and how it relates to their learning. We might continue that. We have so much data, who knows where the data will lead us. And at this time, I want to acknowledge my team and the Center for Global Higher Ed for the grant. And with that, this is my contact information. If you have any questions or you want to reach out, and I'll take your questions now. I can stop sharing. I'll take your questions now.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for the wonderful presentation. So from the audience, if you have any question, do you want to come? You can either type your question in the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand using the feature on Zoom and walk into the room to ask question. So we have two questions, one from Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, do you want to come in? Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicole. I have to say that I arrived midway in your presentation. So in a sense, I'm going to ask a sort of more cross-cutting general question. And that is, having had the opportunity to look in depth at the particular group of students and the particular experiences that they've had, I wondered if you felt there were any particular lessons for other programs or other disciplines, particularly those that might have something in common with that sort of chemistry week and things of that sort, that we might be able to sort of transfer to other categories, because I could certainly see with what you were saying a number of possible links, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Oh, for sure. So another project, I'm gonna go to another project as an example that I was a part of earlier in my career here at Virginia Tech, was working with the EC department, where they had this massive grant from the National Science Foundation to restructure their base courses. And I was working with the curriculum group, since that's my expertise. And what we were trying to find was, we identified that there was far too much in all the courses. So trying to find a line of coherence, right? So the constructivist in me, that students would build as they go along. We don't have to teach them the same content every semester in the courses. If we can find that line of coherence that runs across, then what that gave the instructors the ability to do was to remove stuff from their courses. So not trying to teach everything, trust your colleague to teach this one thing well. Well, every time we would meet with them, I think it was at Wednesdays, and we'd send them off with, well, go look at your courses, look at the course that follows yours and the course that comes behind yours, before yours, and see what can you remove. And wouldn't you know it, every time they came back, they wanted to add more stuff to the class. So, I laugh, but the truth is that I'm sure across any discipline, there is just a bunch of content we keep because we hold so tightly to students must know this. And so we keep adding stuff, and not just to a course, but to a curriculum broadly. They need to learn this thing, they need to learn that thing. And so it just balloons into this massive thing where if people would spend more time being intentional, looking at what comes before, what comes after, and trust that they would pick it up somewhere and have this line of coherence. So it's not so much the content, but what are the objectives and what do they need to know to meet those objectives?
Yes, I would certainly endorse that. I think sometimes when one's looking at that program design, one's thinking, is this topic being introduced? And then are there opportunities for it to be consolidated later on in the program? If I could just finish off with a sort of final sort of perhaps observation or comment, is that I think sometimes that consolidation, if we frame things in that way, it can often be an opportunity where students can pick up particular areas of interest, and that can often connect with perhaps diversity or inclusion related issues, allowing students to pick aspects of the curriculum that they particularly resonate with them and perhaps their career pathways or plans. And if one thinks about the assessments and the mechanisms, then it is the students who've gone and pursued something that they are then feeding that back to their peers. So they're getting it, but not necessarily everybody just getting the same. And one is then allowing students to engage. So I think sometimes it's about how we think about the sort of inclusion in its broadest sense that can help us to embed. But thank you, really stimulating.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Okay, I somehow saw Jenny, you had hand raised, but apparently it looks like you're in your car, so I feel bad to ask you. But
I'm not driving. Just to confirm, I'm not driving. So thank you. And I didn't want to jump in too quickly because I know it's really nice to get other. And Marie, lovely to see you, and thanks for your comments. But I do have lots of thoughts. Nicole, what a masterful overview you gave of this mammoth project and your leadership, particularly on this slice of it. So, and you show us how there's just, the next steps in this project. There are lots of different directions. The thing that for me is tantalizing, the updated data you showed on the hours per week of contact time is so striking, that the South Africans are spending 50% more time over the year. And then, of course, during the week, it's not quite to the same degree because their semesters are longer, but it's still more hours in the week. And this first line of analysis, as you presented it here, I think you're suggesting that majority of students in any program are sort of coping. I'm wondering, what are you seeing? What do you think are the routes for us to try and see if there are any differences in these very different curriculum experiences for students? And I think you're involved in that paper as well. You're involved in just about every part of this project too, which I really commend, and I think it shines through in your presentation. But do you think do you think that you're going to be able to say something, because this is really significant, that and it's such a big part of this project, we've got these different curricula. Do you think you're going to be able to get us to some insights on that, and what is presently jumping up for you as the ways that you and the team might be able to address that? I'm sort of just keen to hear your thoughts on that, Nicole. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Jenny. So I think about one of the many strengths of this project is that we have researchers from these very different contexts embedded in these different working groups. And so even in the society group, we have, the people who are in the US context, we have people in the English context, and most recently, one of the South African researchers joined the group, right? So where we may have these blind spots based on our context, someone else might read the data from a US student and say, wait a second, why are they saying this thing? Because we as professors in the US context may miss it. But we also have researchers from these other contexts who understand the structure of the curriculum, who understands where students are from doing on a day-to-day basis. And while we recognize that there are certain individualities that the students themselves have, a broader, thicker description, understanding of the context in which they're operating. Why is the South African curriculum requiring the students to be in class more time? Or why is the English students, as they progress more, they do less work in class? I feel those may give us the ability to say something to each context specifically, while we cannot speak to the students individually, but having a really thick understanding of the context, I think goes a far way.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm excited to see where you take us on that line of inquiry.
Thank you.
Thanks. Do we have any other question from the audience? I can see Phil and Tunde there.
Yeah, I mean, I could see I've got so many questions. As you said, Nicole, it's such a big and amazing project. So it's just where to start. So thank you so much. And I think definitely such a unique perspective that you can have with this longitudinal studies. It's such a I feel like from a researcher perspective, it's such a nice luxury to have. So I've got so many questions, but for just connecting, for instance, to what Jenny was asking about, it was interesting because I have done research on engineering students and their digital capabilities. So I looked at their curricula it was in the UK. So it was interesting, for instance, that even within a country, I think there can be such differences, because the curricula I was looking at, Nicole, is probably closer to your ideal, constructive, because they do a lot of thrown into project work from day one and probably do fewer lectures than the one you had on your table.
Mhm.
But I suppose one interesting point I picked up from your presentation was on this issue of coping, not coping, because I think you had a slide and a quote on one student transitioning from not coping to coping.
Mhm.
And I thought, it's almost like such an interesting perspective. We could look at it positively, because not coping and even coping is not as positive a word. But I was just wondering whether, looking at it positively, it could also be seen that the course is challenging them. And so that's why, there is perhaps this perception that they might not be coping, but it's exactly what they should be doing.
Mhm.
They should be troubled. Because otherwise there's no that's when the point of learning is so much more powerful, if they have that trouble of not coping, which then converts into coping. So I thought that was quite a nice, to me, I was just interested in that. And I just wonder if you found similar moments or similar transitioning when it's really about the transformative learning experience that they're experiencing.
Oh, for sure. I think I never thought of that, but I can see the power in looking at these transitioning points, right? So, full disclosure, when we started writing this paper, we started with the assumption that, we were going to see stark evidence of agency. But as we started looking more at the data, we're like, no, they're coping. And for us, it was like, they're just coping. But then we saw that, no, that's exactly what they should be doing. And especially since these are second-year students, in the UK, they don't have this general year, but in the US and in South Africa, they had this broad general first-year engineering. So the second year is really when they're starting to get into their disciplinary courses. And one could make an argument for the first year being light. And then because they're now moving into these hardcore disciplinary subjects, then we see them saying, wait a second, courses pick up. I expected that. I didn't expect to not have time. So some of the US students, I didn't expect to not have time to go hang out with my friends or to not have time. So for them, not coping was more personal than academic in some cases. But it's still valid. I mean, it's still valid to them, to their individuality, but to your individuality. But to your point, I think the transitions could be really interesting as to how they are navigating even that space of going from I'm so over my head to now I've figured out a way to make this work.
And then also just what you said, I think that's also such a power of your research, that you're capturing the whole student experience across I think, just how you describe that you're going into why are they doing it and exactly what's happening when they're learning at the same time for them in their home life. I think that's just so interesting because you don't always get that whole student experience from research.
Agreed. They are a whole, I tell my students all the time, there's a whole person that came into the classroom. So it's not just what's happening when you see it, it's all the other things that they're doing outside of the space too. That's important to them.
I mean, is there because I think almost like, so my other question, as you were talking about your research and the longitudinal nature of that, I could see that it's quite powerful that the students who are participating will have this diary for them in a sense of their change. And I just wonder I'm just interested in how you're planning for the research to then utilize, who is it going to feed into, what are the imaginations on the outcomes of the research. And because I could also sense that it could be quite a powerful thing to reflect back to the students at once they are a year in work. But so
I don't know if I have a really smart response to that beyond Paul Ashwin is our PI. And we just kind of go where he leads. But I know looking at some of the later year interviews, and you'd ask them a question, and they would say, wait a second, what did I say last year? I remember this question from last year, which is really it's very, very interesting and very powerful, because not a whole lot of researchers get to engage with the same participants repeatedly. And the students themselves trying to, oh, I remember when you asked me this year, and this was what I said, and here's what I'm saying now. I don't even know if the students realize just the power that comes from this constant interaction. In some cases in the UK, I think they've been fortunate to have the same researcher. So the same researcher did all the interviews, I think most of them. In the US, it changed, but we started having some consistency around their third year, that they had the same, so they actually remembered the researcher and remembered being in the space, being asked the same thing the year before.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a great question and then response. So we have hand raised up from Jen. Jen, do you want to come in, please?
Yeah, it was actually just something Tunde said that really struck me about as higher education researchers, that we do all this research, we talk to all these students, and we stick it in journals that students never read. And it's almost like we assume a trickle-down effect of that it'll be how students give us their words. We then, it's almost a Bernsteinian thinking, we then reinterpret them, and then we interpret them into a journal article, and then the reader reinterprets them, and then maybe they reinterpret them into their practice, and then somehow the research reaches back to the student. But this idea of some more a direct way of linking and talking to students about educational research is, I just think that's a really interesting thing. And it's one of those ideas, it's such a good idea because it's so obvious when someone says it, and you think, and yet we're not doing that, not nearly as much as we think we are. So I don't mean just this project, by the way. I mean, as higher education researchers, I think that's a really wonderful thing you've raised, and intriguing. And yes, I'm going to be excited where this goes now, in my mind anyway.
Nicole, do you have any response? I can see Anne-Marie certainly has some. So shall we just move around in the room?
So what Jan said and the discussion with Tunde made me think of this quote from this book I used to teach my methods course, where it says, we as researchers, we take so much and we give so little back. And it's stuck in my head of, we talk to these students, but they never actually get anything tangible from what we did. We hope that there is some impact down the road, or we'll say, well, it may not directly impact you, but it will better the program for the next student. But the ones that participated get so few out of it. It's really something to reflect on, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, can I just come back on that? Because I don't think that I was suggesting that. In fact, it's exactly what you were describing, that by having these conversations, you might be doing, it's a typical insider researcher issue in research, or because it's having those conversations with the students, you are then promoting their reflection about their learning, which is, again, a really good pedagogical practice. So they are getting things, because you were just describing how through the conversation they are flicking back and thinking, and probably thinking about where they've been and where they're coming from. So exactly, you are, by doing the research, you are already causing some change. So this it's that ethnographic dilemma or opportunity, in a sense, that you're making.
Maybe we just hope for something bigger. We want to do something real big for the students.
Okay, and Mary, do you want to comment?
Yes, so that, I think that was a really interesting little flurry, in a sense. So I think, just picking up on what Tunde said to finish off, I think certainly often when students are involved in that interview process, and in fact anyone who's involved in an interview process, they often find that for themselves it's self-revelatory. They almost didn't know what they knew until we have enabled them to perhaps share that. But I think picking up on Jan's observation and point about, we take that, we then process it, and we then deal with it. Not so much in although there have been some colleagues across the university at Lancaster who have been involved in our postgraduate certificate of academic practice. And one of the modules on that is a module I facilitate called SPACE, which is a scholarship of practice and academic curriculum inquiry. So they take a particular curriculum interests that they have, and they use and explore scholarship particularly. So it's not empirical research predominantly, it's mainly literature review or engagement with other aspects of scholarship. But they then will share that. And one of the forums where they have been sharing some of that information has been at our Inclusive Learning Network, where I have been actively trying to get some of our students to come along. And although predominantly it's been perhaps some of our students from the elected student officers and things, what happens when they are there to hear some of those things is that they are then able to interact in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have done had they not been there. And our conversations have been all the richer because they have been able to make their observations at the point where perhaps somebody is sharing what has been found in the research and what's been identified, but also using that as another opportunity perhaps to lobby for further change or think about, okay, so this is what the research says, what are you now going to do, or how can we now bring about change? So I think, although it's only small numbers of students, I think, there are opportunities whereby when that happens, you can actually see that it alters the context of the discussion, and certainly the sort of I suppose in a sense the context and the approach that's actually engaging in, and it does feel that it is a more inclusive way of involving them in some of the ongoing developments that might occur as a result of, in this case, these colleagues' work. And just a final quick thing, when I used to teach our own undergraduates, and I think that was again picking up perhaps on a final point that Tunde said, I had a regular thing. We have our institutional feedback forms, and they tend to perhaps, feedback goes into the ether. So I used to have would have a particular point in the feedback to the next cohort. I would say, this is what your peers said. This is what I'm now doing in response to it. And then when I was asking them questions at the end of the year, I would say, during the year, I've picked these ideas up. What do you think about them? So that one was actually making it much more explicit rather than it just sort of, again, going into the system, so that they really felt as if they were, my attempt was that they should feel listened to. So, so a practical suggestion and a few other observations. Possibly too much. And I'm sorry, there's not a question in there, Nicole, although I'd really welcome your feedback.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
I like that. This is what your peer said. Even if you got information from students who took the course before. So this is what the students who took it last semester thought about this thing. And yeah, that might be a good way. I like that approach.
I can just probably walk in. I don't know, it can be just me, but all my research ethics form, I always have this line that, what is the direct or indirect benefit for my participant? Certainly they will have opportunity to talk to me, to reflect on their experiences. That will really help them to transform some of the thoughts and perspectives. So I don't know, that's my line always. I copy and paste basically. So maybe that's what they can do. Okay, Jen.
Yeah, just following up on that, I think that is a really interesting thing about research, is that in this busy world, people have too few opportunities to be heard and to be listened to. And, so, we have the Viva where people have to listen to you for an hour or two. But in the rest of life, it really happens so rarely. So I do think that there is something in the interview process, potentially. I mean, of course, they can also be quite exploitative, but potentially there's something lovely about recognition, about saying to someone, you know, you're important enough that I want for an hour to hear about your life and what you're doing. So, yeah, I'm with you on that one, Kungmi. I think that's a lovely idea. And I do think that's why we've got such good data in this project, because the people who've done the interviews, there's been high quality. There's been a lot of work done to build relationships. And as Nicole said, some of those relationships go over years, several years. And, you know, so everything's been done in that sort of way to bring the students in.
Great. Tunde, do you
Oh,
have a
no, if
question?
someone else was there, then that's fine.
Oh, no, it was me, so you can go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to ask Nicole, because I love the way you introduced and were motivated to do this project. You know, your trajectory of, in a sense, you were so passionate about engineering and you got this heart and by in industry, and then you're doing all these amazing research now. I just wondered if have all these interviews and this, in a sense, I suppose I'm trying to get back, because one of my interesting doing the research with engineers was that I learned so much about the discipline. I already had a lot of respect for engineers, but having done the research, it's incredible what sort of things they get up to. I'm just wondering if this research has rekindled your passion, or so talk a little bit about that, because I was just interested by your motivations of doing it.
So I now realize that sometimes I think, that's a really interesting question. Sometimes I think I jumped the gun on leaving method too early. Like, I didn't give the job a chance. So I teach first-year engineering students here too, right? And so sometimes I ask them, oh, what do you see yourself doing with your career? And they'll give you one of those answers that make your eyes roll back in your head, like they're going to solve world hunger or something. And change the world. And I try to not be cynical. They're first years. They don't even know. But anyway, as I engage with students who then went on internships, like, I see the passion for, even if you're only moving the needle a little bit, that you are actually doing something to move the needle. But, you know, maybe my dreams were too big to begin with, or maybe I realized I really should have given that company more time to see if I did move the needle. But I just felt like every day I was there, I walked in, I sat, I programmed, I had team meetings, I came back, I checked that the thing was running like it should, and it was just so boring. Of course, I was younger, so, you know, you need something happening every 5 minutes, and nothing was. And so I would really be keen on seeing what the students talk about. So we have not gotten that data yet for the US. Now that they're almost a year into work, to see if their same reasons for wanting their degrees hold up. And I think that's the power in following the same student over time and seeing how they change. And now when they're in a very applicable setting where they're now applying what they learned, to see how their motivations come through after having left school and are now in work.
Yeah, that's so exciting, I think. And in a sense, you have found your passion in education. So that's helping people move their needles.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But the first time a student says, yeah, you know, I'm gonna change the world, you'd think it was a scene from The Exorcist. My eyes went so back in my head, it was kind of funny.
I think they need that to cope, isn't it? They can cope to change the world. So I've been saving my question. So is it all right for me to throw mine? So, I mean, for me, it's really interesting. Some of the things that you really said about the institutional culture, or even nation culture that students are involved in. I think that's like the whole set of disciplinary practice that's all involved in different external factors like that. Personally, I've been educated in North America, and I came here for teaching. And then one of the things that I often hear from my UK colleagues are UK, it's like proposal of higher education and culture of higher education quite different, and often USA and UK are, to comparison. And then there's kind of commonly saying the US higher education is more practical and pragmatic, and UK is more philosophical. So, that kind of comparison is often made. So I'm just wondering, in bigger picture, do you really see that kind of very different, so some obvious difference between two countries, especially in terms of the proposal of higher education, what is really stressed to the engineering students? Is there really something practical and philosophical, that kind of difference there?
So watch this space. There's a paper I'm working on with Jan in the society group, where we're looking at students' description of their purpose for going to university and getting their degrees. And I can tell you the differences, the reasons are so varied across contexts. You see the US students say, you know what, I just want to make a lot of money, and engineers make a lot of money. And so that's what I'm doing. And then we are seeing a more societal view of wanting to have impacts on the environment, doing more recycling, caring for others, coming from our South African students. It's ridiculous. And then the UK students, they too talk about the job and they talk about the family. But I think the difference is more stark between the US and the South Africa student. Even the UK students, the English students, they do mention, a furthering of themselves or the discipline or society, but not in the same ways the South African students talk about it. It is very interesting. And I don't know if I would have thought about these very differences in how students are shaped through their socialization with their families, because a lot of them talk about the family, but within the context in which they learn. Had I not been a part of this project, I never would have imagined that the differences were so varied. Jan?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that, because I think that is a really fascinating part of the project that Nicole's just outlined there. But it also shows the value of doing this sort of in-depth qualitative research, because of some of the South Africans, if you just looked at a tiny chunk of the data and not, read all the context, they do still say, well, I'm doing this because I want to get a job or I want to earn money. But whereas, without stereotyping, the students in America might be doing that because they want money for themselves. South Africans, it's very often, but of course I need money if I'm going to help my community. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to support my family and, my elderly parent, whatever. So the contrast is really rich, because even when they seem to say the same things, they mean such different things by them. And I think one of the nice things has been that we've found that we've become more and more inclined, I think, in each of our groups to look at whole transcripts, because, it's all there in this sort of rich description that doesn't easily chunk out, but with such an enormous project, you have to chunk it out at some point, otherwise you'll just go mad. There's no way in. So yeah, but that contrast that Nicole described, I think is really important.
Thank you so much to both of you. So there is difference. So that's good. I was puzzled.
There really is a difference.
Yeah, indeed. All right. So it seems like we had such a great conversation. So unless we have more questions or comments from audience, I think it's probably good for us to wrap it up, especially given that Nicole is so early for you. So you may want to grab the coffee from downstairs finally. I hope that open now. So is that all right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So just I want to just say thank you again to Nicole for the great conversation, and I really enjoyed after the after presentation follow-up conversation was really good. I just want to close the session by introducing our next seminar, which is going to be next Wednesday, which is 24th November. And then it will be presented by Dr. Meg Blackie from Stellenbosch University, South Africa. So actually, it's like from same project that we're going to hear from the other side of the world on the similar topic. So it's actually really good. And probably perhaps, Nicole, you can join us again next week at the part of it. No pressure though. All right, so next, the title of the next presentation is going to be In Search of the Person in Tertiary Chemistry Education. So by saying that, I want to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much for coming and wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.